Welcome to On the Soul's Terms podcast, a weaving of astrology, Greek mythology, and depth psychology. I'm Chris Skidmore, an astrologer, psychotherapist, and craniosacral therapist living in Ubud, Bali. In this episode, I'm joined once again by mentor, friend, and guiding voice in the world of astrology, Brian Clark. This conversation is the beginning of a two-part journey through the 12 houses of the astrological chart. In today's episode, we move through the first 6, from the emergence of the self in the first house, through embodiment, value, early relationships, the family field, and into the rituals and routines of daily life. More like walking through a house than touring it. So I encourage you to take your time with this one. Listen for the felt sense of these spaces, not just the definitions. Brian brings his usual depth, warmth, and mythic insight. We speak about dreams of home, about the second house as a site of embodied shame and resource, about siblings and story, and about the ancestry encoded in the foundations of the fourth. We don't rush it, and we'll return later in the year to explore the second half of the wheel, from the 7th through to the 12th. So take a breath, let yourself arrive, and step with us into the interior landscape of the chart, beginning, of course, with the invitation to listen. It's true, there is a sort of a participation with both of us and with the mystery, isn't there, that happens. And I'm just always loving the way that you sort of pick up on words and tones and particular things. You kind of like have that listening that happens in the background for what else is going on. And that's what I think I most appreciate about our work, is like the ability to pick up on those little subtle cues that in the everyday world seem to just kind of pass us by so many times. But yeah.
Well, it was in, I guess, I wouldn't have called it deep listening at the beginning of my astrological practice, but it certainly was listening, and it was in the listening more than the techniques or more than what was going on. It was in the listening that actually opened up the world of astrology for me. It wasn't the techniques; it was listening to the stories. Certainly that the techniques certainly provided, but it was listening that was really one of the great keys for me. For me.
I think there's been a lot of moments where I've seen you kind of, and I do this as well. I believe that it's kind of like going, well, who's this talking? Like almost something comes over, and that's when the listening peaks up of like, oh, who just stepped in to there's sort of different, I mean, these days it's called internal family systems, and there's a lot of things around all these parts work and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's been there forever, but I think astrology gives a particularly unique vantage point on all of that kind of work, given that we do have the gods and the archetypes and other invisible.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I was thinking, oh, I don't see it that way, but I see it a very similar way that I hear the chart speak. I hear part of the chart speak, like I hear that speaking. That's what I'm listening to. I'm listening to that part of the chart speaking through the words and the story of the client, through our collaboration, through our discussion.
Well, our discussion today is specific to my new project on the podcast, and a couple of years ago, as you know, we went through the zodiac and the zodiac and the circle of animals, and had a wonderful time wandering around in all of those different signs, and I enjoyed that whole process immensely. And then I took a year sort of exploring the archetypes and the tensional points between different archetypes, as it was a kind of a less structured year, I guess, exploring all sorts of things. I had a big section on Hercules and Artemis and Aphrodite and all these different things. But now getting him back into a structure, it's been really interesting since having the call, I guess, to walk through the houses of astrology. How much since that moment of deciding to do this, already I feel the houses really opening up, and we were just talking before coming on of like how the houses almost like they can be left unexamined, or they're not fully inhabited or something. There's a sense of you just sort of say, oh yeah, and it's in this house, and say a couple of words about that, but then really move into planet and sign. I just feel like that maybe it's maybe a habit of astrologers to do that. And it's been a beautiful thing to sort of to try to enter the houses and to build them up and to sort of see who's inhabiting those houses and what's going on there, what's written on the door and this kind of thing. And even just at the very beginning of this process, as I've only just done the first house, I'm noticing a real shift in my own approach to it. So I thought it'd be great to get you on board the show as someone who has written books on the topic and you know, lots of articles and things, and just have a deep reflection of your own process of, you know, what are these houses? What does it even mean to have a house in astrology? Maybe we should start at the very bare essentials.
Well, I mean, that's a metaphorical question as well, isn't it? And I think that's what, when the houses became metaphors for me of place, and recognizing that, you know, there's certain, I remember it was 30 years ago now. It was at the Pluto and Sagittarius conference we did in Melbourne. I gave a lecture called Hades' Place, and so it was an introduction in a way to the whole the geography of the underworld, the places of the underworld, the rivers, the entrances, the exits, what happens in it, and you could see that every god has a place. So Hades has his place at the underworld. You might say that Hestia has her place in the hearth. And then that hearth, you know, you can see it in the Prytanean, the council chambers. You can see it in the Olympic torch. You can see Demeter as having a place. So that began my kind of reflections a lot more deeper on place. And then also seeing it as archaeological, that houses have layers, you know, so there's layers. So I started to think about any house, you know, we call them stories, don't we? Houses have stories, and they weren't just stories as we know stories, they were also layers. And in questioning clients, oftentimes when they speak about houses, I would hear a deeper layer. Like it would just say the second house. It just wasn't about their money. It was about the attitudes to money, about the family's attitudes to money. It was about resources. It was about values. And so I felt that houses had this kind of, what can we say, archetypal layering to them, you know, spiritual, physical. And that would all inform the literal place that we were in. So I guess I'm not really starting, as you said, at the beginning, but for me, that was a beginning of recognizing that place is a very potent play. You know, we have the spirits of place. So in Greek myth, we have the dryads of the spirit of the trees, or the nymphs of the spirit of the forest, or the nereids of the spirits of water. And every house had a spirit to me. Just like that's what the Romans used to believe. You know, they had the spirits of the home. And so that's where it opened up for me and became much more richer and deeper.
Yeah, and I feel like with just like with actual houses, right? We can see the house from afar, and we can look at it and say, oh, that, you know, this is an interesting looking house. We might even be able to describe the house, or what's written on the door of the house, or the shape of the house and how it is. But it feels like a whole different concept, almost like one I hadn't really thought of before doing this series, to be honest with you, of actually going and entering a house and looking around and seeing, as you say, those layers, like who put this there? You know, let's say we're in the second house, like who put this idea of money in here? Right. And, you know, what's under that, or whatever it might be.
Well, that's interesting in itself, because then we go back to the history of how the houses sort of developed over time. You know, who put what there. But when you're speaking, of course, when you enter a house, Chris, if the house is historied, you know, some houses you walk into and you get this incredible feeling, you know, there's history. There's history. There's just not like pictures on the wall, but there's history, there's stories. You get a feeling. You walk into different rooms. And how many times have you dreamt of a house? How many times have you actually dreamt of a house and going through a house? Yeah,
So
many
many.
times.
Yeah, so
Yeah, so
many.
many. And oftentimes, I mean, many clients have had these, long-standing dreams of homes over years. And all of a sudden they're putting an extension on the home or they're, and of course, the house and the home, I guess we start, if we're thinking astrologically, we start to think of the fourth house a bit, don't we? But all houses have those layers to them. Like I know that, many texts you can read about the 12th or the 8th, fourth as being ancestral homes or that we can get those links, but every house has a layer to them. So every house will have an ancestral, familial feeling about that house. So I think, yeah, you're right. Every time we enter a house, there's a base. Well, not necessarily in Australia, but when I grew up in Canada, we always had basements.
Oh yeah.
And so, we have layers. And as, we have these layers of homes. But I think it's the history of a home that makes it soulful. It's when its
Mm.
history got something to it.
Yeah, the history of it, and I'm just thinking about, because you brought in the dreams, and that was really, I don't know for the listeners out there, but when Brian said about like dreaming of a house, like there are so many houses in my psyche that I go to quite regularly in dreams that I can recognize. And yeah, they do change and morph, and they might even morph within the same dream. But yeah, they could change over time. And it's interesting, even just other places. Like when I was young, I worked at a pizza shop when I was at university, Chelsea Pizza. And I worked there for about 4.5 years. And even very recently, I've had a dream of being back in that job, back at that place. There's a whole bunch of pizzas coming out. I'd forgotten how to do it, or, something like this. And I've even had it just kind of almost waking into that dream thinking, what am I doing? How did I get back to this job, delivering pizzas? How did we get back here? And then sort of waking up and going, oh my God, okay, I'm not there. But those places that we spend a lot of time in holding all these memories, like physical places that can sort of like become, I don't know, stand-in places for dream motifs that go on for years and years. I mean, that's 25 years ago that I was working there. And yet it still kind of has a little hold somewhere in my consciousness.
Well, I mean, you said back at the place. I was wondering what that place was, because places aren't just, they are physical, no doubt about it. There they are, that's a place, but they're also highly emotional. 25 years ago, you would have been in a very, transitional perhaps, or, something new. There's an emotional place as well. Every house in the astrological chart also has an emotional place to it. And so I find that very powerful, because if a planet is speaking out of that place, like if we knew what the pizza place was in the house, if I think, oh God, what's that? It was first, it might have been the sixth house. But I might have said, let's imagine for a moment, you had Mars in the sixth house, and we were talking about, you were talking about a kind of confrontation you might have had at the pizza store or something in the dream. Yeah, I would immediately have pick that kind of area up as far as a place, because it holds emotionality. Any planet in a house will hold literality of the place, but will hold the emotionality and very much the psychology of it, the familiarity of it. So I think, yeah, it's so powerful, that sense, as you're saying, the dream. But also, Chris, if you think about it, like let's think about that through the, held onto the angles. When the sun sets, let's imagine at 6 o'clock, let's take the equator. And you can imagine it goes through every house about 2 hours, so that the sun is in the sixth house between 6 o'clock and 8 o'clock at night, and you can go through that. You can see too how, many people awaken around 3 o'clock and sometimes 4 o'clock in the morning because of a dream. They don't remember the dream. They just wake up and they're thinking, oh, I'm awake, what's happening? But it's usually because of a dream. And that's just after the sun has, of course, started to rise up, from the third house to the second house. And so I've oftentimes thought about just that very simple sun going through the 12 houses as how we can also orientate ourselves in many ways to conscious life.
That's so interesting. Can you say some more about that? Because, of course, when the sun rises, it comes out of the first and into the 12th.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
it's a
Exactly
curious
right.
thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
very curious thing. And this is what you've hit on something very important, I think, in houses is that the houses, of course, the planets rise in a clockwise position, but we count the houses counterclockwise.
Yeah.
So what you just said is the 12th house in astrology is often presented as this house of asylum, of hospitals, of prison, or in more modern astrology too, of a kind of, the collective unconscious, this kind of thing. But like you just said, any planet in the 12th house has just risen. It spent the whole night under the horizon. And so a 12th house planet is like, the way I think about it is imagine you've just woken up from a deep sleep and you're waking up and you're remembering all these images, shades. And, that's why the 12th house is so mysterious because you're still in that zone between waking and sleeping, just like the 6th house. You're in the zone between, the sun setting. You're in the zone between leaving work and coming home.
Mm.
The 12th house, you're in the zone between waking up and getting ready for work. So, or the day. So the houses can be a lot of, can we say, what can I say? I was going to say sustenance. It's not quite the right word, but a lot of ways of thinking about the houses can be seen through looking at the clockwise direction. Yeah. And that's what the ancients did too. They were so looking at those rising and culminating planets.
And is that how they like formulated the houses? I mean, it's an odd concept, I got to say. Houses. It's an odd concept. Maybe we can help ground the concept to people listening.
Well, it's really difficult to know how they came in. Like I probably the first kind of records we might have is just around the BCE to CE, just around that zero mark, 2 millennium ago, when Hellenistic astrology sort of brought that in. But they always saw the rising, so the rising sign, the rising planets, the rising place, which was really the sense of beginning, entering, light, became kind of an anchor point, I think, for the houses, because that's why in traditional astrology they often call some houses bad houses and good houses if they make aspects to the ascendant. But I think the houses were a way of placing. And if you think about bringing heaven down to earth, those are the houses. The houses are terrestrial in terms of reflection of the celestial place, if that makes sense. More than the signs and the planets, this places ourselves. This locates ourselves. This creates a place out of space. If you're just looking at signs and planets, you're still in space. But when we create a house, we place it, we locate it, and we don't have to locate it in a city. We can locate it in a country. We can locate it in our heart. We can locate it in our brain. We can locate it in another person, and that's how we place things. So, if you go back to Architres, like in the 5th century BC, he sort of said that, well, is ascribed that he said this, but he said that place is the first of all things, because everything that exists is in a place, and it can't exist without a place. So for astrology to place itself, the houses have become very powerful and important.
Yeah, so it brings it down. I like that it brings it down to earth, and without houses, it's floating around. It's still floating as concept. And then, these are places of the soul, aren't they? These are in where we inhabitat, or where our habitat is, or where our habits are in those particular arenas. And of course, right now I've just done the first house, and I'm preparing the second house. So it's kind of interesting right now. I'm myself in the cut. This is like what happened when
Yeah,
when
absolutely.
when I did the
Absolutely.
signs, right? I was like, oh my goodness, I'm just like moving in between
Yeah. Yeah.
these signs, and right now I feel like I'm in the first and heading into the second, even though that's the wrong direction for what you were talking about, the
Yeah.
clockwise. But it's curious.
Oh,
In
it's
a,
not the wrong direction. No, it's not the
the
wrong
other
direction. It's just
direction.
the other direction. Yes.
Yeah. But I guess it is interesting that even though the sun is going sort of 12th, 11th, 10th, 9th, and so it's going that way. I mean, all the planets are, but, let's just talk the sun because it's the easiest. And yet, numbers-wise, we go first, second, third, so we go anti-clockwise as we go around. Isn't that interesting just within itself,
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
conceptualizing time and space
Yes.
in that way?
Yeah.
But as it is, I'm in between that first house and the second house, which I'm sort of realizing is something of the first house can be quite an ethereal, conceptual, daimonic, like, oh, this is me, but it hasn't really landed anywhere yet. And then the second sort of goes, okay, let's see, let's put some roots into that and just see
Yeah.
what are your values, or what is your sense of self? What's your relationship to body?
Absolutely.
And to sustenance and to resources and therefore to money. And it's fascinating just to feel that, like we talked the other day about mythic threads, and that's now the name of the newsletter. It's like that thread that ties the first into the second here. Maybe we can sort of zone in on that one.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. Can I just, I don't want to forget that. That's really powerful. But I wanted to say that what your experience is what I experience when in classes, when you go through classes, well, we'll do Mars this week, and everybody gets that archetype of Mars. Or even when I did a year-long tarot class with a wonderful tarot teacher, doing one card a week, the archetypes were alive. So see, the
Yeah.
archetypes are alive in you, and that's powerful.
Yeah.
I do want to address that. You're absolutely, this idea of movement to the houses, like the first house, you could see that, as a kind of a sense, as you say, like it's being born. It is very ephemeral. You're kind of still not quite conscious, but the second house is that kind of, I think, the movement into the sense of knowing one has a body, like, and feeling the body, and the embodiment. And I wanted to address the fact that I listen to clients, and oftentimes when they talked about shame, or I mean, I never read this anywhere in any book, but for me, I saw that thread through the second house quite a bit, because of course it was body shame, and the stories that would come up, second house stories around toilet training, or
Oh, wow. Yeah, right.
like all these first images of. And not so much Taurus, but around the second house. It wasn't about Taurus, more second house. And I thought, because it's like where we place our body, how we are placed in our body, isn't it? The sense of that. It also had a lot to do with the way that we were able to take in food, and so there was ways of thinking, I think, that for me, I'm just saying for me, because everybody sees it differently when they look at a horoscope, that the houses became, just as you're saying, this sense of movement, like you're in a movement now between incarnation, you're moving now into a second house realm. So that takes me back to your pizza dream, because that was where you made money. It was a job.
Oh my
You were
God.
in a
My
job,
pizza dream is in
thinking,
the second house. Okay.
well, I wonder if you were making money. Were you supporting yourself, trying to get through college? Were you, what were you doing?
Yeah, I used to make $8 an hour and $1 a delivery. That's how we started off, and it was just to get just enough money to squeeze through university. Hopefully pay for rent and just. Of course, it was a pizza shop, and so we would often, end of the night, you'd make pizzas and you'd maybe take them around to your mate's place and chili bomb somebody. That's when you put a lot of chili in just one slice, and then you just like wait to see who picks up that slice. And so, it ended up being one of these things where there was it was all guys working there, all boys. There was a couple of girls just working the phones, but generally for some reason it was a man job. And I just had this really shitty car, this Ford Laser hatchback. Sorry, Mum. I know you'll be listening. So I got that, Mum. I got that car off my mum and totaled it. But anyway, I just turned the car, which I guess is kind of like third house, into the money of the second house. And it just scraped me by so that I could make it through my long and arduous university career where I was not interested at all in what I was learning.
Yeah. See the story of the story. See, a story always underpins it. And, one of the interesting things, Chris, I find about it is just a very simple, totally simple statement. You take the ascendant, and you take the second house cusp. I think signs on the cusps are so important because they're like gates. They're like, oh my God, I'm in a new territory. I got to cross the border. Got to get my passport out. I got to prepare to go across this border. Now, your rising sign is, that's the way you kind of moving out. First house cusp, the way you're moving out to the world, you're going to get that. And then all of a sudden come across the second house, which is a little bit more, have to be more embodied, have to be more grounded.
Mm-hmm.
And I've told so many clients about how when they're preparing for a job interview, use your second house. Tell them about your resources and your talents. Don't tell them about your personality because the personality is so at odds. Because if you've got fire rising, you've got Earth in the second house cusp. I mean, I've got Gemini rising and Cancer on my second house cusp, and the resource, the Cancerian resource, is what has actually provided me with a life.
Yeah.
Not my bloody Gemini rising to talk your ear off. That's not going to get me far. It does get me far. There's no doubt about it. But what gives me the resource and the depth and the grounding is the Cancerian part.
So interesting.
Yeah, so it's always interesting. Now, in of course traditional astrology, that's what they call the bad house because it's not kind of aligning itself to the ascendant. But I've always found those wonderful, like the sixth house. It doesn't align itself to ascendant either. It's always going to be an odd if there's no interceptions. And so what you have is a challenge to your personality, through health, work, health, well-being, regularity of the sixth house always challenges, your personality. And so you find people, like for instance, with water rising, who've got fire on this, fire in the second house cusp. That's really worth, just reflecting upon. It's very powerful.
So how would that look? So the personality is more watery and fluid and what have you, but then they have to go out and make that money happen with the fire, would you say?
Well, their resource, they have this wonderful resource. They're resourced by fire. And, so what you'll also find is, fire then on the sixth house cusp as well. So like the challenges are in the fire, so like for water rising, for fire rising, the challenges are in the earth, the grounding of what we're speaking about.
Mm-hmm.
But so the way that you can really work the houses in a way that's very personal for you, and tells a story for you.
Yeah, so we come from the first house. It's just kind of like the self is born and hurrah, I'm born. But then we have to go into the second to resource that self. And as you say, food, grounding and our resources and our sense of body being embodied or not comes into the second. And it's interesting with the second, isn't it? Because I'm trying to decouple sign from house as I go, but the second house I have found to be quite Taurian.
Let's just differentiate between a sign and a house for a moment. A sign is a quality. It's a quality. It's a modality. It's like it's a kind of it's both a vice and a virtue. I think it's the sign. The house is a place. So I know what you mean. Is the archetypal underpinning is very kind of, the footing is very similar.
Yeah.
But of course, traditional astrologers would they do very much separate signs and houses, and I feel that way too, the difference between, as I said, place and quality, but I can still appreciate that the second house does have that Taurian qualities to it. But I think it's more what we're have a personal sense. When we get a second house, that's personal. Taurus is not necessarily personal, is it?
Mm,
It's the same for everyone. But
right.
my second house doesn't have Taurus on it. It has
Yeah, of
Cancer on it.
course.
So what I
Yeah.
mean, so it's very personal. So the way I resource that is very different, and it's like I find value in the felt experience, in the emotional experience, in
Uh,
the
yeah.
in the personal experience.
I like that distinction and like that. So then you go from that sort of bursting out of the personality, getting born into the second of the embodiment, and then your relationship to everything that involves, including money and resources and what have you.
Think about like the first time you ever. Well, sorry, I'm going to now apologize to your mother, but every time you felt, you felt your mother's breast, or you touch something, or you grasp something. I mean, that kind of those motions of embodiment, feeling embodied.
Hmm.
And so that second house. I mean, I like the second house too. It's like how we form an attachment to possessions. Like I always tell people with plants in the second house, so make sure you name your car. You know, name name your couch. Embody it. Because that's what the second house does. It embodies things. We get attached to our first little blanket. So,
Hmm.
the second house is filled with um, attachment theory, object relations more than attachment theory, but object relations.
Hmm.
How we identify. So each house too, I've found not all houses, but many houses have powerful psychological theory behind them. Like
Yeah.
object relations is one of those,
Hmm.
and how we do attach. Out there in the world, in certain circles, we would say, well, that's materialism. And I don't feel it's materialism to be attached to something that is valuable.
No. Yeah, and you mentioned sort of the personification of our things, to give it a name, to give it a, because
Personify.
and this is again back to Hillman. He talked a lot about this, right? Of like the soul of a building, or the soul of
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
road, or the
Absolutely.
soul of all
Absolutely
these things
personify.
that even if it is man-made, the humans got involved in the creation of it, but it's still within creation.
But the difference here, I think this is Taurian, but maybe second house too, is beauty. You like
Hmm.
when you look at a building that's been, like an old building, its history, it's so beautiful. But when we take the soul out of the building, like with a machine, with a kind of like plastic building, there's no soul in it. So when Hillman was speaking about that sense of ensouling the material world, that's when it is alive. But we've lost that ensoulment. Now we have machines running our world that are God knows what unconscious motivations have been put into that world. So
Hmm.
it's the underbelly of that as well.
Hmm. Yeah, or I'm just thinking about the copy paste model of
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
architecture, which is
absolutely.
just like evidently and obviously ugly, even though you can find beauty even within that. But the difference, like last year when I was in Florence, for example, and just feeling how every building had so much beauty and history in it. The Renaissance has just sort of like flushed that place full of soul and beauty, and just being in those buildings or even around them just was so uplifting.
Beauty arrests us, it stops us in our tracks. It takes our breath away. I think there's a syndrome called, is it the Florentine syndrome or something, something like that, where people they just get so arrested by beauty, they get almost panicked by beauty, not, like as a syndrome. Like it's a quite a fascinating thing that when place isn't sold, it is
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Even in its weirdness,
Mm.
if it's had, when I say weirdness, it doesn't have to follow any kind of trajectory. It just is ensouled. It becomes beautiful. So I think that second house, if we still keep on there is a sense of the second house helps us in soul, the world we live in, in terms of that.
Yeah, and I'm even thinking about the project of this year ultimately is to help people find these houses in a way.
Yeah,
To discover
absolutely.
these houses and get really curious
Yeah,
about that.
yeah,
And so I feel us sticking around the second. So I'm going to how do we get
yeah.
out of the second into the third?
Well,
What's that cusp?
what we, well, I could say, how is your sister doing? Or like, how we get the third house, if we could imagine, okay, so we, if we just take the early forms of life and you've gone through toilet training and everything, now you're beginning to form words and speak and language and ideas. And third house is this house of, and add the similarity to Gemini perhaps here, but the third house is a sense of how we ensoul our language, our words, our stories, the stories of our life, um, and the early population of our life. And the first population of our life, that of an equal is oftentimes a sibling. So siblings are third house. And the sibling is a powerful image for me of the third house because it's also the first, if we're the eldest sibling and a new sibling comes along, then we're usurped. So it's our first also experience of being displaced or replaced. So, being displaced or replaced. And if we're a younger sibling, it's like, the first kind of experience of some other. So the first experience of otherness and schooling. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard of third house about early schooling and the wounding of early schooling. And just as you, even university, in your case, what you're saying was you didn't want to do it. There's a third house experience there. It didn't suit you. It wasn't designed to suit you. It was designed for some other mass, but you weren't part of it. So third house becomes a kind of place how we go back to find a real sense of what we love to study, what we love to nurture. It's a powerful, and in our early friends and the way we relate. So all those things are beginning to take place in the third house. And dare I say, my experience is just not your sibling. It could be, if you got the moon in the third house, it could be your mother wants to be your sibling, or maybe it's something about your mother's sibling. There's a story around moon, mother, and sibling, third house. Or if you've got, perhaps a kind of Uranus at third house, maybe there's a story around a disconnection from sibling, be it in your generation or in another generation, that is part of your own soul story. And how do you work with that? So that's where you start to see it's fairly rich.
It's very rich. It reminds me of your book, Sibling Constellations, and I'll put a link in the show notes to check out Brian's book on that, because I just remember in the introduction you talked about how underdeveloped the sibling story is within psychology, right? How we focus so much on the parental dynamics and family systems and things like that, but so little is said about the sibling or siblings or lack of, or adopted siblings or step siblings, or all the myriad of ways that could show up in any one given person's life. And I remember really being moved by your exploration of that element and spending some real time in that field of sibling dynamics.
Well, those are stories I'd heard in my consulting room, and I listened, I guess, again. But on our tour, so that's where that's, I said, on our tour in the third house is I think where the sibling became important, whether we're an only child or not. The third house represents this place of relationship. It's the first house of relationship. It's the first house of relationship. So it's like where we go back to really understand an instinctual element of ourselves and how we relate. I think that's very important.
And I think you said in that book, or maybe just in conversation, like this is the only person or candidate for a person that we could be with from the beginning to the
That's
end,
right.
or,
That's right.
like the
Yes.
longest
Yeah.
standing
Longest
relationship,
Yeah.
often beyond parents, and, and that equal other or semi-equal other, because of course birth order
Yeah.
plays in
Yeah.
there, but
Yeah.
that one that you really have to contend with, and maybe that's part of the second house for those resources. Maybe that's how it links, or the thread goes from second to third.
I think so. Yeah. And I think the third, then what I love about the houses, it the signs can become quite, what's the word, not judgmental, but in the third house, like, you realize, well, arrival is part of life. Like, I play on the word arrival, like arrival, but also arrival.
Yeah.
But arrival is part of life. Of course, we're competitive. Like, and that's the third house has got that kind of, there's a competitive element to it as well, I think.
Yeah,
Because of
sibling
that.
rivalry. I mean, it's fascinating being in psychotherapy and hearing, as you would have heard over the years, like just how many stories of siblings there are and how many variations there are. I mean, it's hard to even track how many come through. And you went brilliantly through the Freud and Jung and their different experiences of having siblings in that book. I really enjoyed that. And Freud's story is compelling, isn't it?
It's compelling. It's very compelling, as is Jung's with his losses and so on. And one of the things too about the houses is as we move into the fourth, like we then have gone through the first four signs, and then so in a way, elementally, we start to repeat. So when we get into the fifth, we have more of a kind of beginning again. So like the first house is beginning, fifth house is beginning. The fourth house is the first, what they call house of endings. And I was always thinking, well, why are the fourth, eighth, and 12th kind of dubbed houses of endings? What ends there? I think what ends is a kind of layer of personal understanding about our place, like a maturity, an ending of childhood, perhaps an ending of family, an ending of fourth house of, like, okay, it's our family, it's our home, it's our depth, but it's also an ending of some sort. An ending because we can't stay there. We have to leave there. And there's always losses in those houses, like the fourth, the eighth, the 12th, because that's part of life as well.
Yeah, so we go from that third of siblings and the experiences and everything. Then we cross over an interesting threshold here, right? Because we go over the IC, and this kind of rooted ancestral line dropping down into the other side of the sky, the darkest part of the chart in a way, isn't it? It's like the other side. Absolutely. And we cross over into, something of I know the eighth house is inheritance, but this seems like a deeper, some kind of inheritance as well down there from the fourth of, like, ancestry, karma, whatever our ancestors had in relationship to the gods, I would say, or nature, or each other, or, what happened back there. And of course that we have to go into the deep dreaming because we don't know, we can't know, especially if you go back and back, right? There's generation after generation back there, and you just can't know where some of these patterns formed. And that's why I find fourth house, obviously my chart speaks to that too, but I find it a really fascinating house, taking us into the deep unconscious drivers of family dynamics, deep into the labyrinth.
Absolutely. The sense of, I always differentiated between the fourth and the 12th house is like the kind of ancestral lineage that goes right back to our indigeneity, like right back. But the fourth house, I used to try to keep within four generations, just to, but the lineage goes back. But you can see the pattern there that starts to move. So I oftentimes, like, see the angles are so very powerful, but you'll often see the IC, as you mentioned, when you're looking at family charts, repeated, children's planets on the IC of their parents, or the IC is connected to another angle in the chart. It's that placement links us, ties us in to a thread of family history. And, it's also too about how we belong. It's powerful because it's like one of the powerful things about place is homecoming, always wanting to come home. And you so rightly, the IC is the beginning, like it's midnight. We oftentimes think of beginnings as sunrise or spring, but beginning is winter, beginning is midnight, beginning is the IC. And that is the power of home, of wanting to come home, so people in fourth house planets always have a very powerful sense of home, be it a lost home, Neptune of the fourth, or a kind of, the way you can think about every planet in the fourth house is how do I sense home? And that's not a place. It is a place, but it's a psychological, metaphysical, spiritual place inside of us.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where it's home, but it's also the fourth house, which is also just another one of your, not just another one, but another one of your interior landscapes or interior soulscapes and these places. And so it has a reflection in the home of origin for sure, and a reflection through our ancestry and lineage. I like that distinction to draw it to four, kind of like phallus. I'm just thinking about or in many traditions, right? It's like you're in the middle and there's 3 forward, 3 back, sort of a way to look at ancestry, yourself as a future ancestor. And yeah, how that, and the IC, I think you've said some things to me before about the IC of how we might feel about home, or how we might look to feel anchored or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
To feel anchored, to feel safe, to feel it is our deep interior self. It's a foundation stone. So I like to think of it as the IC is like the ballast of the ship. Like you got the big mast going up there, the MC, but you need a ballast to keep it steady, especially if you're on a rough and rocky road. And so the IC is oftentimes that ballast, and sometimes the ballast is very rocky. It's the foundation stone. It's the deep place inside of us where we can feel anchored and grounded and settled.
Or the opposite of all those things. So it's kind of nice to...
Yeah, absolutely. Especially like, you see planets. So you get, say, an outer planet. Now, those are planets that are beyond the scope of our own understanding. We have the personal planets, we have the social planets, but the outer planets are beyond the scope. And so when you have an outer planet in the fourth house, it's like the family has, what can we say, been infused, if you will, with atmosphere. The atmosphere is infused with things beyond their control. So that there's some kind of family trauma or family secret or family story that has affected one's sense of safety and security. Mm-hmm. So the fourth house is also a way of thinking about the atmosphere of the family atmosphere. What's it like? Was it stormy? Was it pleasant? Was it sunny? The climate of that time. Mm. And how we adapted to that climate and how we felt in that climate.
Would you also have hometown or home place there, or not so much?
Yes, absolutely. Country of origin, place of origin. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's kind of
like real estate.
Yeah.
You go right back, literal level, like out there, real estate. Somebody's asking a real estate question, go to the fourth house. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so then, how did we transition from the fourth into the fifth then? And what is the fifth? We start again, don't we? In the new element, as you said, we go into another firehouse of the fifth. So what's that transition like? What's that angle about?
I guess what came to me, like through my practice, was this image of leaving home. And it's that wonderful Beatles song called She's Leaving Home. And it's a beautiful song too. You should listen to it. I think it's very fifth house. Because the parents, of course, don't want her to leave home because she's rushing off with some man. And my generation, in order to leave home, that's what we did. We rushed off with somebody else. We went to another country. We did something. So the fifth house is to me, is how we transition from that first phase of our life, which has been built around our sense of family and security, and how we transfer loyalties from home into the adventure we're about to have. That's why they call the fifth house love affairs, because oftentimes it's the first house where we kind of have a relationship with someone outside the family zone. We don't want to tell the family. We don't want them to know. It's the place where we experiment with our creativity and our sense of self-expression. We can't talk in the first house, but by the fifth house, we've got an audience. We want a presentation. We got a self to express, and we want to express it.
So it's almost like these first four houses have been building towards this fifth in a way.
Yeah.
And then we step out, whether that could be out on our own, or it could be out with a lover, or it could be out in the midst of a tumultuous romance. But one way or another, we leave behind, or we don't fully, because everything is like, you can come back, of course, but there is that sense of like leaving the nest, and then what happens when you move away from that deeper sense of roots and security, and how you feel about that, whether that's like fifth house excitement, or fifth house fear, or fifth house, whatever, what your relationship to that fifth might be, which could have symbols of like what's on the cusp and what's in there. But either way, you're going to know this just by reflecting on it, right? Like what is your feeling about that?
What's your feeling about it? What emotion comes up? What stories? Like, so some of the keywords for the fifth are like, like children. So, and so when we can't think about the circle of the houses as a straight line, as if we're moving from A, B, C, D, because the fifth house, or children, comes before relationship, the seventh. So we can't think of a linear line here, but because children are really the metaphor of our own creative process. Pregnancy, the falling pregnant, yes, is very much a fifth house arena. Literally, it's a fifth house arena. Psychologically, it's a fifth house arena. We fall pregnant with our own creativity. And so we can go back to when we're talking about the second house, a sense of value. And one of the things I've often talked to clients about is the kind of the sense of pregnancy. And it's been very interesting with the fifth house, because I've often seen that lying underneath this fifth house can be a story of loss of a child in the past, or pregnancy in the past that didn't come to full birth, or a child that hadn't been grieved for, which is down the line of not affecting, but carrying the fate of this to the person that's sitting in front of me in the consultation. So just in the fact of talking about a baby that hasn't been grieved is a very powerful thing. Because we're talking about a creation that hasn't come into being, and that's fifth house. Like, how do we bring our creativity into being? So let's talk about the losses that go with it as well. And that then has been very powerful and transforming for me.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, I feel like it's so much more common. As you know, I went through that a few years ago, and what was really helpful for me was to understand just how common that is, but just how little it's talked about. Once I opened up and started talking to people about it, it was interesting to see just how many people came through. It was like, oh, this actually happened to us, or this happened to me, or this, this was my experience too. And those literal losses. And then I'm thinking about sort of creative losses as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. See, as you speak about that, in my generation, of course, and many of the clients, the early clients I saw were, of course, when I say my generation, we're talking about the Pluto and Leo generation, but it was like the parents believed that if they kept their child from seeing, the grief and loss, that they were protecting their child.
Yeah.
And I had many clients. I remember many clients. One was just springing to mind about who had, Pluto in fifth house and Gemini moon, which big story. But she had her sister had been run over on the Hume Highway, and she was watching, and she felt guilty all her life for this because her parents wouldn't include her in the grieving. She was always locked out and locked out and locked out. And it's like when the parents interfere with the fifth house. They can't protect us from the fifth house is about learning about the loss of creativity and learning about the loss. Not that it's going to impede us or lessen us. It's actually going to help us understand the power of creativity and how it is reborn. Because the child that hasn't, or the creativity that hasn't been born, will in some way be reborn if we can mourn and grieve.
This is such a different perspective on the fifth, which you would, usually talk about it as play and games and fun and romance and everything, and we're getting this much deeper layer. So I appreciate that.
Well, that's just been my experience.
Yeah,
because you know why, Chris? Clients don't come to me to talk about their play,
no,
and their creativity, and their fun.
But out of it could come play and creativity and fun, right?
Yeah,
and self-expression,
absolutely.
and that's the
That's
rebirth
exactly
of the
right.
self that's available in the fifth.
When you look at the sun card in the tarot, it's like that rebirth. The child coming out. A child is a creative force. It's a creative force, and the loss of the child is it's just unimaginable because it's just so it's very unimaginable, but it is still part of the grief of life and can be reborn. And as I said, it often goes back through generations.
Yeah. Wow.
And so what I like to think about from the fifth house, and I don't think we'll have time to finish them all over, but from the fifth house to the eighth house, then it becomes more the interpersonal journey. So the first four houses are really like a very deeply personal journey. Now we're on an interpersonal journey. And while the sixth house is very important, health and work, but I like to think about the sixth house in terms of falling between the fifth and the seventh, as I like to call that, on the way to the wedding, because the sixth house is where I think we learn about how to be separate. Like we've had our romance in the fifth. If we're going to be equal in the seventh, we got to be separate. You know what I mean? You got to learn to be separate. So there's a kind of sense of the sixth house has that sense of then how we separate ourselves through our own rituals. We're taking care of ourselves, cooking our own meals. And that time in life, if you can think about it, you'll remember this. When you used to share with all those mates in a household. That's very sixth house. It's like you're not at home, but like you're not at home and you're sharing, and there's a kind of a quality of sixth house there. Like you could, like, who's going to cook the meals? Who's going to do this? Who's going to clean that? So it's learning how we take care of ourselves in the world, take care of ourselves, really.
I remember that time in my life so clearly because my house burnt down, Brian. My house burnt down.
What do you have at the cusp?
Well, I got Chiron in there.
Well, yeah.
But, yeah.
But what's on the cusp? What's the sign on the cusp?
It's Taurus.
Burning down the house.
Burning down the house.
And Venus?
Venus is in the 8th, of course.
Yeah, Venus is in the 8th.
Yeah.
But what I bring up there is that I like that sign in the kids, like the sign of the second house, the sign of the sixth house cusp is like, to me, where we oftentimes build up stress. So like the sixth house is where it's a sense of our well-being, the sense of how we structure our daily life. It's like work, it's like how we work. And so structure becomes important and so on. And of course, it's a house of well-being. So when we're not, when we don't like our work or whatever, and stress builds up, I like to think of that sign on the cusp of the six as where, what part of body's holding that stress, just a simple way. So for you with Taurus, it's going to be the throat.
Right.
Going to be there in the throat, and the ability to be able to, articulate and so on. And maybe the stress also too gets embodied. So when we have earth signs of those cusps, like the second and the sixth, we tend to embody a lot more.
Interesting.
We embody it. Whereas if it's, say, if it's air, it gets into our nervous system.
Right.
So it's just a way of thinking. I'm not saying every chart is going to respond that way, but when I've had a lot of health issues, I look at that, because the first house and the sixth house are very much about health houses, and that sixth house becomes very powerful in helping people work with their well-being.
Interesting. First and sixth on the horizon there, just underneath the horizons on both sides.
That's a good point, because what we've talked about so far is all the houses under the horizon.
Yeah.
That's one of the first ways to differentiate houses. Below the horizon, above the horizon, or east of the horizon, or rising or setting, east or west of the horizon. And those are all kind of held in by the angles, or the solstices and the equinoxes. And therefore they become very powerful markers on the road of life, those 4 points.
Yeah.
Change.
Well, I feel like we've gone first to sixth, which feels perfect for today. And I am going to invite you to do a part 2 in 6 months, if you're up for doing 7th, 12th.
Oh, for sure.
Because for now, I think that's like so much juicy information. And so, if the audience can hear sort of like, hopefully you've been able to go with us on that journey from first to sixth, which covers half the houses. And it's all, as you say, under the horizon. We've just been to the underworld, or maybe the deep parts of the ocean. I'm not sure what's down here. But anyway, that journey from first to sixth, and the formation in a way of the self, right? The formation of the personality. And then once we click into the seventh, we invite that other in, and a whole other can of Dionysian wine opens.
Well, we invite otherness in, whether it's in the form of a person or an event, or but it's our otherness that we meet in the seventh. We dance with our shadow in the seventh. So
there goes the other. So we won't get into that other just now. We'll stick with we'll wait.
Because it's always there.
It's always there. Amazing. Oh, thank you, Brian. Thanks for giving so much of your time today. And I'm already anticipating our part 2 when we introduce the other. But yeah, I appreciate you and your work.
Okay.
And anything else you want to say to the audience on your way out of this episode?
Well, thank you for listening, if you're still listening, but also to, and thank you. Well, I want to thank you for supporting Chris's podcast, because it's great. And I really appreciate that, and appreciate you, Chris. And we'll see you soon.
Beautiful. Thanks, Brian. See you soon. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.